So this is chapter 17. This focuses on industrialization, and as we'll see, and you'll hear me repeat throughout this PowerPoint, industrialization is huge. It changes everything. Any nation that goes through the industrial process is going to see literally every facet of life change, down to the way people structure their daily lives. So this is not the kind of quote-unquote revolution that affects some people, but not everybody. Like your day-to-day life doesn't really change very much, because if you think about it, when we talked in the last chapter about the Atlantic revolutions, and we talked about how, you know, in the past, sometimes you would even be conquered by another nation, and for the average person, it really wouldn't have made a big deal. Okay, now you have somebody else in charge of you versus this ruling family. Now you have a new ruling family. How you go about your day-to-day life is not going to change. This is not one of those revolutions. This is huge. This is changing everybody's lives from top to bottom. So one of the ways that we can tell from this image that it changes daily life is the huge environmental impact that we're still seeing today. Now that's the thing about the Industrial Revolution that we're going to talk about, and that I'll also repeat, is we're like within industrialization right now. And we don't really know at what point we're living through industrialization right now. Like, are we at the end of industrialization? Are we still at the beginning? Are we in the middle? We don't really know. We're still feeling those effects. And the environmental effects are one that are continued to be felt today. So this is a picture of industrial Britain. You've probably heard of the very famous London fog. Well, London fog is not actually fog. Like, you wake up one morning and it's foggy outside. It's actually coal soot, coal dust in the air, and is an effect of industrialization. So here we have our little introduction, and we're comparing a quote from the head of the UN Environmental Program, who stated in 2017 that humanity's advancement in science, technology, and industrialization is harming the planet, hence the need to reverse course. So again, acknowledging the continued environmental impact of industrialization, and it's something that's being talked about with renewed interest today. At the same time, a lot of people, especially those from nations that have either yet to industrialize or are in the process of industrialization, they want to catch up. And so, for instance, this professor from the University of Ghana in West Africa saying we need to industrialize, because if we don't, we are not adding value to what the African continent has. And so looking to catch up with those nations that have been industrialized for hundreds of years at this point. And that's an issue too. So if we're going to reverse course in terms of the environmental impact of industrialization, how do you make sure that it's done equitably and doesn't hurt those nations who have become recently dependent on things like fossil fuels, producing fossil fuels? So, which leads to a 21st century dilemma. How does one embrace industrial improvement in human life while protecting the fragile planet? And it is a question that we have yet to answer. So, the origins of Europe's Industrial Revolution start in about 1750, and I'll repeat this again, it starts in Great Britain. For a variety of reasons, it starts in Great Britain. You could do a whole class on the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. It's a huge topic. Many, many books have been written on it. So that would be something that if you were to go further in your history classes at the college level, you could look into taking a class on that. The human way of living and our relationship to the planet have not been so changed since the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago. So don't think about that. The Industrial Revolution is the biggest thing to happen to human life since the agricultural revolution. And if you don't know what that is literally when we figured out how to plant crops and raise animals. So if you can think about how much that changed everything about human life, it is what led to civilizations, because prior to that, we lived in hunting and gathering societies. Hunting and gathering societies, at least at that time, did not have the ability to create a civilization because they were too busy hunting and gathering. And so all of that changes with the agricultural revolution. So that is what industrialization is on par with, just to give you an idea of how big of a topic we're talking about. And I always used to think, like in my early part of my academic career, like, oh, industrialization is so boring. It's just about like machines, like the textile machines and the wool mills, and even though I love history, it was not a subject that was really interesting. Now I think it's fascinating just because of, again, how big it is. And for the fact that, again, we don't know where we are in the industrial era. Are we still at the beginning? I mean, it started in 1750, but in terms of historical time, that's not huge. We could still be at the beginning of it. Again, we could be in the middle. We could be at the end of the Industrial Revolution. We just don't know because we're living within it. So we don't have the gift of hindsight to look back and say, oh, this is when it started, this is when it stopped. So the origins of the Industrial Revolution lay in the population growth and an energy crisis. And this led to the development of non-renewable fossil fuels for energy. And that's where we still are today. We are slowly making that transition away from non-renewable fossil fuels for energy. And again, is that part of the Industrial Revolution, or is that going to signal the end of it? We don't know. There are much greater amounts of these kinds of energy available at the time. Things like coal. One of the reasons why the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain is the access that they have to large amounts of coal. Oil, of course, is known to us nowadays, as well as natural gas, but also guano, which was also used, which is... it's kind of gross, but it's bird droppings. That's what it is. We won't go into too much detail about that. Okay, so there are significant technological advances in the 19th century, especially with this culture of innovation. And the innovation starts with the textile industries. These are really where the first bits of industrialization happens, in which inventors, industrialists look at ways to more effectively spin cloth. This is going to be hugely significant, not only because of the technology that they came up with, these big power looms that would spin cloth on a massive scale, but that kind of technology led to the development of other things, ways in which they could power those textile factories a lot faster. And again, it just kind of goes from there. And this is hugely significant, not just for Great Britain, but it's also going to be hugely significant for the United States. Prior to this new demand in cotton, because of course you need to spin some sort of material in order to create textiles, and then the subsequent invention of the cotton gin, slavery was actually in the process of slowly dying out on its own in the United States. It just wasn't profitable anymore. Now the Industrial Revolution is going to change all that. So anyway, this is going to lead to different kinds of technology, coal-fired steam engines, which are going to be then used to create locomotives. They're going to be used to power ships. Different kinds of chemicals, eventually electricity, precision machinery, the telegraph and the telephone, rubber, printing, and different advancements in agriculture. These are all happening as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Again, it's huge. That's why whole classes are literally taught on the Industrial Revolution, and whole books are written on the Industrial Revolution within certain countries, especially Great Britain, where it started. So again, in this class, we just kind of skim the surface, unfortunately, because it's all we really have time for. But yeah, I mean, the amount of things that you can look into that change because of the Industrial Revolution is just never ending. Okay, so here you can see they are producing in a factory gas from coal. Obviously something that's going to create a great deal of pollution, and we are living in a time in which there are no restrictions on pollution. There's also there's no kind of government entity that's looking at workplace safety. Like here in the United States, we have OSHA, which is a government entity, part of the bureaucracy that makes sure that your workplace is safe. That didn't exist at this time. I mean, it's so new. These new factories and this new way of working is so new that part didn't catch up very quickly. And so it's certainly a very dangerous time to be alive, specifically if you are lower class, which we are going to talk. Here we have an early train as an exhibition, people literally standing around and watching it. Because again, it is something that's so new, a new technology, hoping to keep pace and to improve transportation to keep up with increased outputs. So with that, as I said, the Industrial Revolution brought enormous increases in the output of goods and services. In Great Britain, again, the start of the Industrial Revolution, from 1750 to 1900, industrial output increased, their output in general increased some 50-fold. And this kind of growth spread from Britain to the rest of Western Europe, then to the United States, then to Russia, and then to Japan. As we'll see, not all nations are going to industrialize at the same time. By the 20th century, it becomes global. So again, other nations are going to be, and in some cases are still rushing to catch up. So here we have a map of Europe. And anywhere you see in green is going to be a major industrial area. So you can see how this is by 1850. So this is fairly early on in industrialization. Again, it begins about 1750 in Great Britain. So you can see quite a bit in Great Britain centered around some major cities, places like Liverpool, Manchester, etc. And then it's going to spread out starting in Western Europe, mainly in Northwestern Europe. And then it's going to slowly spread throughout the rest of Europe, the United States, Russia, and then again Japan. However, again, with industrialization, there was a mounting impact on the environment. If you have to extract raw materials from the land, of course, the landscape's going to be altered by that if you have to have mining or whatever method you're going to be using. Also, again, there's no regulation on factories or mining or anything, so sewers would then just empty industrial waste right back into the environment, particularly into drinking water, which is going to lead to a lot of issues, as we'll see, especially for those of the working classes. Smoke, of course, pollutes the air. Some people are going to be voicing opposition, but really the trajectory of progress is going to crowd out those people crying out for change for a long time. And for many historians, the Industrial Revolution is going to usher in the age of man and this big, huge leap forward in progress. So a massive increase in output occurs as industrialization begins to take hold in Great Britain. Again, huge increase in textile industry output. That's first. That's the first real industry to industrialize. And then the improvements there lead to improvements elsewhere. Because of this, because there's an increased output, you need an increase in transportation. And so you see the rapid development of railway systems. A lot of the dramatic increase was in mining, manufacturing, and services. And because of that, agriculture became less important by comparison in terms of what they are sending out to the rest of the world. So in 1891, for example, agriculture generated only 8% of British national income, whereas prior to that, it would have made up a huge portion of their exports. And again, the vast transformation of daily life. If you think about it, this is something that is going to be putting, a small scale farmer out of work, and so you're going to see people moving from the countryside to cities. It's rapid urbanization because people have to look for jobs. You think about how different your life is. You go from being, a small scale farmer to working in a factory. And working in a factory is not something that people had experienced before. This is new. This is brand new. And think about how different your life is. Whereas even if you're a small craftsman, you're really working on your own time. You're creating something from beginning to end. If you're a farmer, you're doing the same thing. And now you're working at a factory doing one thing, this repetitive motion over and over and over again. And it's dangerous. You're not on your own time. You have to be at work at a certain time. You're working 6 days a week. You're working long hours. The pay is very low. It's dangerous. And again, you're not your own boss. You're not working at your own pace. You're at the mercy of somebody else. And that's a traumatic process for many. And many different people were affected in many different ways. It's just a total transformation of literally how people are living their day-to-day lives. Okay, so how did this affect the different levels of British society? We'll start at the top with the British aristocracy. So landowning aristocrats had little material loss in the Industrial Revolution. But as the aristocracy declined over time, this is because urban wealth became more important. A lot of the aristocracy kind of clung to the old ways of doing things, which for them, they were large landowners, and they rented their land out to tenant farmers, and that's how they made their money, because money was in land acquisition. It was in agricultural output. And that changes with industrialization. That's not where most of the money is. And a lot of them, resisted that change. Were not interested, saw it as beneath them to become involved in any kind of business, because for the aristocracy, one of the marks of being an aristocrat was that you didn't work for a living. Your land was your land generated your wealth, and you really didn't do anything. That was being a gentleman, quote unquote. And so they clung to that, and so a lot of them did see a decline in their political clout. A lot of them lost a lot of money. In fact, there was a great movement. It's very interesting. This is another effect of industrialization, where you had a lot of wealth being generated in the United States, and a lot of these really wealthy daughters of, big industrialists like, the Rockefeller family or the Vanderbilt. Think of those kinds of people. A lot of their daughters went over and married British aristocrats. Winston Churchill's mother was what they called a buccaneer. She was a wealthy American heiress, and she married a British aristocrat. Why? Because they thought it was, it was for social cachet. You're becoming an aristocrat yourself. And on the other side, for the aristocrats, it was a way for them to get money. Because again, they're clinging to a dying system, and they're losing money quickly. And so they need an influx of cash, and that's coming from these daughters of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. So that's just one example of how big the reach of industrialization is. So again, businessmen, manufacturers, bankers, they're becoming wealthy. Titled nobles do retain great social prestige, and a lot of them are able to retain some personal wealth, or they get it by marrying, again, rich American heiresses. But many do also find an outlet in Britain's colonial possessions as a new way to gain money, and we'll talk more about that next week. The middle classes have the most obvious gains from industrialization. For the upper middle class, they are able to become extremely wealthy. Many of them become industrialists themselves, and their wealth just becomes astronomical, so much so that they're actually able to literally buy their way into aristocratic life, either by imitating the aristocratic way of life, buying a country home, an estate, a home in London, or literally being able to get a title because they're just so wealthy, they're granted an aristocratic title. Generally, the rest of the middle class, there's going to be a large number of smaller businessmen and professionals, people working for large industrialists, accountants, lawyers, etc. They tended to be more politically liberal. They stood for thrift, hard work, rigid morals, quote-unquote respectability, and cleanliness. Those are all kind of hallmarks of what we would consider the Victorian age, starting with the reign of Queen Victoria at about the mid-1800s. And it's interesting because here you see the middle class setting the tone for the rest of society, and that kind of gives you an idea of how powerful they were able to become. Samuel Smiles, who wrote the book Self-Help in 1859, again the Victorian era, said that individuals were responsible for their own destiny. And this ushers in this new way of looking at the poor, or maybe not a new way, but a more prominent way of looking at the poor, they're poor because of their own shortcomings, not because of their circumstances. And that's going to be something that's it's still around to a certain extent today. Middle class women were also more frequently cast as homemakers, wives, and mothers. It became a sign of making it in the middle class that your wife did not have to work, and your children did not have to work, and they could thus go to school. Because then, as in now, school was a way of propelling yourself from one social class to another. And here you see, this is actually a French painting, but this is an example of the industrial middle class. You can see a family that is clearly very well off, enjoying tea at their home, being served by a maid. Having a maid, again, being another sign of the middle class. If you think about it, you're being middle class, you would be able to afford a maid, a cook, a nanny for your kids. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you would only imagine, somebody nowadays being very wealthy, having that kind of staff around. Certainly not the sign of the middle class, but that, again, gives you an idea of the growth of the middle class. All right, so the lower middle class, this would be service sector workers, people like clerks, secretaries. So a step below, again, the people we were talking about before. So at the top of the middle class, you have those industrialists, the people who are owning the factories and making great wealth. Then you've got the middle class, so people, professionals, lawyers, accountants, etc. And then you've got, the people below them, the clerks, the secretaries, so on and so forth. And by 1900, they're about 20% of Britain's population. And note, industrialization also opened up employment opportunities for women as well as men. Oh boy, the laboring classes, they really, they take a hit, certainly. It's never an easy time to be poor. I'm not trying to make that argument, but boy, was it really tough to be poor at this time. In the 19th century, about 70% of Britons were workers. The laboring classes suffered the most and benefited the least from industrialization as well as rapid urbanization. By 1851, a majority of Britain's population was urban. That's a reverse of what it was just a century before. And by 1900, London was the largest city in the world. So that's an impressive feat, but think about what that means for the laboring classes. You can't have a city grow that fast in population and expect housing to keep up at like a respectable pace. So you can imagine the kinds of living conditions that the lower classes were forced into. So they were horrible. There's really no getting around it. Vast overcrowding. Again, it's dirty, the smoke, the pollution, inadequate sanitation. If you're living in row houses, you might have, or an apartment building of some kind later on, you would be expected to share an outdoor bathroom with everybody else. There might be one. Sanitation is not great, and because of that, there's epidemics. People tended to live in these row houses, so think about very small and not nice at all townhouses, just long, like going across, like down a whole street. And that would be where poor people would live. Very few public services, and by that I mean pretty much none. There's really just nothing. I mean, if you're, there's no bus service, there's no, train service to help you, and there's also no help for you if you're poor. And that's another thing to understand about the lower classes at the time is the line between we're working class, but we're getting by, we're making money, we're putting food on the table, life is extremely difficult, but we're getting by, and absolute poverty, just abject poverty was so porous at this time. It was so thin. You could easily fall from one to the other. All it took would be, for instance, somebody having an accident at work and either dying, maybe your main breadwinner, or being injured in such a way that they can't work anymore. Now you're destitute. There's nothing for you. There's no disability. There's no help from the government. There's no unemployment. There's no food stamps. There is nothing for you to help you get back on your feet. And again, that leads to a host of other issues. For example, in the United States, this is what I wrote my master's thesis on. There is a huge problem with children being placed into orphanages because, again, that line was so porous that a lot of kids in orphanages had families, but their families couldn't care for them because of just one simple accident that was very easy to have because, again, workplace conditions were very dangerous. So this led to the development of what was called the orphan trains, where they took all these kids from major cities and they sent them out west to work on farms. So they just, for many reasons, but for one of them is there was huge overcrowding because of how, again, easy it was for a family to become just destitute with no help. Again, and there's nothing for you to turn to. There's no help. Very few open spaces for parks, places to play, and inadequate, often polluted water. That leads to this picture here. Says Death's Dispensary, open to the poor, etc. And you can see the people there are getting water from a pump, being pumped by this death figure. And that's accurate, unfortunately. Again, sewage systems were not regulated. Sanitation was not regulated, and neither was industrial waste. So all this went into drinking water, and people drank it. People were literally drinking human excrement and toxic waste, and they were getting sick. For instance, that's how you get cholera. So you'd have these outbreaks because of dirty water. So, moral of the story, be grateful for being able to have access to clean water. Nowadays, I understand there's currently a movement where people like to drink, as they call it, raw water, which is non-filtered water. Please don't do that. You get cholera. Okay. There was very little contact between the rich and the poor. You have that middle and lower middle class that's basically becoming like a barrier. And if you think about it, to the example I led before about the way things were with aristocrats and their tenant farmers, you have contact there, right? The aristocrats are the wealthy ones, and your tenant farmers are generally poorer. And you are their tenant, and so you would see them on a fairly regular basis, and you would know who they are, and you would interact with them and talk to them about rents and output and whatnot. Now that's changed. You have your industrialists. They don't have any day-to-day contact with their workers. They have the people of the middle class and lower middle class to do that for them. So there's very little contact between the rich and the poor. As a result, industrial factories offered a very different work environment. Very long hours, there's no restrictions on work hours. Very low wages, there's no minimum wage. And child labor, there's no laws at this time about child labor. These were typical for the poor. What was new was going to be the routine and the monotony of the work. It's dictated by the machine, direct supervision, and discipline. So take, for example, child labor. It's not necessarily unheard of. In the agricultural world, kids would be expected to help out on the farm. That's not unusual. So the idea of a kid working, that's not strange. But a kid working in a factory, now that's strange, at the dictates of some sort of a manager or somebody overseeing them. And again, you're not working at your own pace. You're working at the behest of somebody else. Industrial work was also insecure. It's not safe. Many girls and young women were killed, were worked in textile mills. Many were injured or maimed. Many were injured and maimed in other places as well. Also, there was a gendered hierarchy of labor in factories, with men in supervisory and more skilled positions, and typically if there were women working, they would be in lower paid positions. This is an interesting picture. This is a picture of a group called the Luddites smashing a loom. So this group in Great Britain called the Luddites, who were opposed to industrialization, because you think about what this means for the small craftsmen. It's death to their industry. And so a lot of them opposed industrialization and would literally go about like smashing machinery to try to voice their opposition to this change in the way of life. With that being said, there were social protests. There were what were called friendly societies for self-help, especially for those of artisans, again, who were seen that were being put out of business. Other skilled artisans sometimes wrecked machinery, as we just said. They burned mills after being displaced by machinery. Some joined political movements aimed to enfranchise working class men or to extend them the vote, thus giving them a voice politically. Trade unions were legalized in 1824, and growing numbers of factory workers joined them, though not without great difficulty on their part. They fought for better wages and better working conditions, and at first the upper classes greatly feared them. The working classes joining together was something that was very frightening to them. Something else that also spread were socialist ideas. Robert Owen kind of predates Karl Marx here in a way. He established an ideal industrial community in New Lanark, Scotland. There's going to be a whole bunch of people like him trying to establish these so-called utopias, like a better way of organizing societies. None of them last very long or are particularly successful. But Karl Marx is going to be the first to lay out the full ideology of socialism. Socialist ideas were attractive amongst more radical trade unionists and some middle class intellectuals in the late 19th century. The idea of giving the means of production, ownership of them, to the people, or to what Karl Marx called the bourgeois, to the proletariat, I should say, and letting them have shared ownership of it rather than private ownership. And of course, many people were opposed to these. However, the British working class movement remained fairly moderate. Political parties such as the Labour Party, which was established in the 1890s, advocated for reform and a peaceful transition to socialism. But generally speaking, material conditions for workers improved in the second half of the 19th century, and capitalists and impoverished working classes didn't really polarize because of a large middle and lower middle working classes, and workers were able to better their standard of living. And part of the reason why it was there wasn't a vast overthrow of the social order like we're going to see in Russia is because Britain was largely a fairly democratic society. They do have a monarchy. It's a constitutional monarchy. And slowly over time, more people are given the vote in Great Britain. And so you're going to see more stability there than you're going to see in a place like autocratic Russia, for example. You also are going to have nationalism at work here. Nationalism bound workers to their countries rather than to other workers around the world, and that's going to be significant as well in limiting the power of trade unions. But immense inequalities remained. By 1900, Britain was in an economic decline relative to newly industrialized states like Germany and the United States. This is also going to result in a massive migratory process that's going to uproot millions, setting them in motion both internally and around the world. So if you think about this, half or more of the rural population of Europe migrated to cities. And again, think about the change in the way you live your life that's going to represent. Additionally, 20% of Europeans between 1815 and 1939 left Europe due to poverty, rapid population growth, displacement of peasant farming and artisan manufacturing, overseas labor demand, and availability of foreign land and cheap transportation. Those are all a result of industrialization. So what they're saying here is that between 1850 and 1939, 20% of Europeans are leaving Europe because of industrialization. And that's another effect, again, of industrialization. And here is where they mostly went, mostly to the United States. There's a huge migration of people who are going to be coming from Europe to the United States at this time. Many people can trace ancestors back to those that immigrated at this time. Rare would be somebody of European descent living in the United States who can't trace an ancestor back to this point in time and this reason for immigration. So there's going to be a temporary increase in Europe's share of the world's population. The greatest impact is going to be on the Americas. Immigration to Latin America is also going to change the social makeup of many regions there. Immigration to the United States, as I just said, was larger and more diverse than elsewhere. And this became part of that great American myth of us being the melting pot, as we have all these different people from different European countries coming into the United States and becoming, over time, American. You also see European immigration into the Russian Empire as well. Again, not as big as migration to the United States. And 13 million are going to migrate to Siberia from Russia and the Ukraine as well, looking for work for industrial. So the Industrial Revolution moves out of Great Britain, goes to the next logical spot. The next closest neighbor would be continental Western Europe. Places like Germany, Belgium, France, etc. By 1900, it is also established in the U.S., Russia, and Japan. Anywhere you look, it's going to have some broad similarities to any place that industrializes. So if you look at industrialization in the United States, you're going to see some pretty broad similarities with Great Britain, for instance. There's, of course, going to be differences, but broadly speaking, you'd be able to make some comparisons there. One of those is that the aristocratic, if they have one, of course we don't have an aristocratic class here in the United States, so if you have one, that's going to decline. Artisanal classes are going to decline. They're going to be put out of work. And peasant classes are also going to decline, whereas the middle and working classes grow. Middle class women are also going to withdraw from paid labor, and again, that's a sign of being in the middle class. You don't have to work. Whereas working class women are paid low wages and had difficulty joining unions, and were accused of stealing jobs from men. And you also are going to see the establishment of trade unions and socialist movements, no matter where you look in the nations that are going to industrialize. But again, it's not going to be entirely the same. Industrialization is affected by cultures of the lands where it establishes, the pace, the timing of an industrialization. For instance, in the United States, there's going to be a bit of a pause during the Civil War in our industrialization. Again, it very much depends on where it's going. For instance, French industrialization was slower, and because of that was perhaps less disruptive on the daily lives of the people of France. Germany focused at first on heavy industry versus other kinds of industry. So again, it's very much dependent. Each nation is going to have its own particularities. So we're going to look particularly in the cases of the United States and Russia and kind of compare and contrast those two to give you a better example. But again, that applies to any country that you're talking about. So in the United States, we're calling this industrialization without socialism. Our industrialization also began with textile mills, similar to Great Britain. This becomes even more explosive after the Civil War. So again, we're going to see the establishment of some sort of industrialization prior to the Civil War. There's a bit of a pause because our nation was tearing itself apart. And then it's really going to take off after the Civil War. So much so that by 1914, the United States was the world's leading industrial power, and it was very much closely linked with European industrialization. So here you can see different regions of the United States and things that they focused on. Coal mining, deposits of iron ore, silver and gold mining, and then the red dots are going to be chief manufacturing cities. And the bigger the dot, the bigger the factories that you're going to be seeing there. The U.S. government played a very important role in industrialization through tax breaks, land grants to railroads, laws making the formations of corporations easy, and the absence of overt regulation. If you have taken an American history class before, which I'm guessing you have, this is the time of that laissez-faire capitalism, which means hands-off capitalism in the United States, in which you see very, very, very little government regulation of business. This is going to be a time of pioneering of mass production techniques. Think about later on Ford and the assembly line process being applied to cars. Things like that are happening all across the United States. You also see the creation of a culture of consumption through advertising, catalogs, and department stores, which is carried on to our modern world, though through different means. And you also have self-made industrialists becoming cultural heroes. Some of them are truly going to be self-made. Andrew Carnegie, who became wealthy through steel manufacturing, truly was a rags to riches story. Others are going to be wealthy and they're just going to become wealthier. But in either case, they're going to become cultural icons themselves. However, there are going to be serious social divisions, a growing gap between the rich and the poor, the constant labor of the working class. Again, there's no regulation in terms of working hours, and there's no regulation on a minimum wage. That's going to result in the creation of vast slums in cities, and also a growing labor protest, union strikes, and occasional violence. Not on the scale that we're going to see, and we'll see. So again, socialism doesn't really appeal to American workers. Major unions were generally conservative, especially the American Federation of Labor, focusing on more attainable things, not something as big as the entire upheaval of American political system. They're looking for things like minimum wage, a limitation on work hours, an end to child labor, things like that. Also, the massive immigration from Europe in the 1840s created a lot of diversity, and that undermined solidarity. A lot of that is going to be because of people having a racial view on some of these people coming in and being opposed to working with them or coming together with them. Also, the economic growth is going to generate a higher average standard of living, and that made socialism less attractive. Our poverty line is even today much, much higher than that of the rest of the world, and so again, it doesn't make socialism very appealing. People would prefer to work for fixing the system that we're already in rather than throwing out the system that we have altogether. However, there were political challenges to industrialization. The populist movement denounced corporate interests. They died out pretty quickly. The progressives were more successful, especially after 1900. The progressive movement lasts pretty much up to World War I. And socialism was labeled as fundamentally un-American. So again, you're going to see more stability in terms of violent protests in the United States than you're going to see elsewhere, similar to Great Britain, because you have a fairly stable democracy. Again, people would rather fix the broken parts of the system that we're already in rather than tossing it out altogether. That's not the case in Russia, which does not have a stable democracy. It has an autocracy, and that's going to be a huge difference. And it's going to result in the Russian Revolution. So Russia was very much an absolute monarchy, and it had the greatest state control anywhere in the Western world. The Tsar of Russia, that is not a constitutional monarchy. I mean, so much so that the Tsar of Russia didn't even often have a secretary, literally did everything themselves and controlled every aspect of the government. So think about it. In 1900, they had no national parliament, they had no legal political parties, and they had no nationwide elections. Their entire society was dominated by titled nobility, many of whom were highly westernized, meaning were very European in their manner of living, which was not the case for Russia as a whole. And until 1861, most Russians were serfs, tied to the land that they worked, and unable to have much freedom for themselves. Here's a picture of some Russian serfs with a wealthy family. In Russia, the state and not society usually initiated change because society as a whole was so ground down by daily life that they were unable to do so. Peter the Great, for example, Tsar of Russia from 1869 to 1725. He ruled from 1869 to 1725. Sorry. He was an early example of transformation from above. There was the state which directed the freeing of the serfs in 1861. That was not brought about by some sort of social upheaval from below. And the state set out to improve Russia's economic and industrial backwardness. So again, this is not a society that is like a capitalist society. This is not a society that's going to see participation from the people by any means. It's very much controlled by the autocratic government of Russia. So the Russian Industrial Revolution was launched fairly late by the 1890s. It focused specifically on railroads and heavy industry. Also, they were financed in many ways by substantial foreign investment. Industry was concentrated in few major cities, and there were fewer but larger factories than was typical in Western Europe. So those are all ways in which it was different. However, the growing middle class disliked Russia's deep conservatism and sought a greater role in political life, which again, they don't have like a political participation at all from people. This is not a democratic society, and so there's a lot of resentment from people because of that. However, because it's an autocratic society, at the same time, they're also dependent on the state for contracts and for jobs. So they also relied on the state to suppress worker radicalism. So they're in a pretty tough spot there. The Russian working class, meanwhile, is going to become rapidly radicalized because there are particularly harsh conditions. Again, there's really no working class conditions at the time that are not harsh at this point, but they were particularly bad in Russia. They have no legal outlet for their grievances, and because of this, there are going to be large-scale strikes that are going to rock Russian society from the 1890s on. And because of the instability in the political system, Marxist socialism appeared to some educated Russians and gave them hope for the future. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was founded in 1898, and it got involved in workers' education, union organizing, and revolutionary action. So, a major insurrection broke out in 1905 after Russia was defeated in war by Japan. This is going to be a major defeat of Russia from the Japanese, and as a result, there's going to be, all this resentment that's been simmering under the surface, and sometimes not under the surface, is really going to break out. In Moscow and St. Petersburg, workers went on strike. They created their own representative councils known as Soviets. There were peasant uprisings. There were student demonstrations. Many non-Russian nationalities revolted. There was even mutiny within the military. So there's just, again, a ton of outbreak of it's really an outlet for all their frustration of, again, not being able to participate in any other way in their lives. This was all brutally suppressed, but it forced the Tsar's regime to make some reforms, though again, they did. So this map shows you in Russia, everywhere you see in purple, which is a lot, are peasant unrest and land seizures. Any purple square you see is a workers' Soviet being established. A diamond, blue diamond, are army mutinies. The anchor are naval mutinies. And the green triangle are major strikes and armed workers' uprisings. You can see them throughout Russia. So these very limited political reforms failed to pacify the radicals or bring stability. Russia had so long, and the Romanovs, the ruling family of Russia, it was so unique to Russia because they're so closely tied with the Russian church and with they almost have a mythological role to a lot of the peasants, that trying to become a constitutional monarch just didn't make a lot of sense within Russian society. So the reforms were very limited, and again, they didn't really make sense. So there really wasn't any stability as a result of this. And there was a growing belief that only a revolution would help, and World War I provided the revolutionary. So the Russian Revolution of 1917 is going to be the one that overthrows the Tsarist regime in Russia. And it's a direct result of World War I. The growing losses in war, the lack of any kind of effective leadership, finally brings the most radical of the socialist groups to power. And that radical branch were known as the Bolsheviks, led very famously by Lenin. Only in Russia did the industrialization lead to violent social revolution. Again, there's going to be varying degrees of change in countries where you have a pretty stable democratic society, not a lot of violent uprisings, and you really are only going to see a total social upheaval in Russia. And only in Russia was a socialist political party able to seize power to create the world's first modern socialist society. So beyond Europe and North America, only Japan underwent major industrialization in the 19th century, so in the 1800s. That's going to be different when we talk about the 20th century. Elsewhere, there were only modest experiments in industry, not a huge transformation of society. However, non-industrial societies still felt the impact of European and North American developments. So looking at Latin America here, after independence in Latin America, the struggle for independence in Latin America took a very long time. It was very destructive. We talked about that in the Atlantic revolutions. The four viceroyalties of Spanish America became 18 separate countries, and international wars thus hindered the development of new nations. Mexico, for example, lost vast territories to the United States in the Mexican War, and other countries are going to be devastated by it as well. Political life here is also very unstable. Conservatives tried to maintain the old status quo with the Catholic Church and favored centralized authority, whereas liberals attacked the church, sought some social reforms, and preferred a system of federalism to a very highly centralized government. Often military strongmen were able to gain power. You're going to see a lot of military coups in Latin America at this time. And states often ran through multiple constitutions. You just see everywhere you look, you're going to see a lot of political upheaval. Also, independence brought little fundamental change to social life. Women remained disenfranchised and outside of the political realm. Slavery was generally abolished by 1850, although not until late in the 1880s in places like Brazil and Cuba. So it lasted quite a bit longer in Brazil than it did throughout the rest of the world. Most legal distinctions between radical categories were abolished. Free people were considered equal. However, Creole whites remained overwhelmingly in control of productive economic resources. However, the military and a small middle class allowed for some social mobility for others. However, the vast majority of people were impoverished, and only rarely did active rebellion occur. So, facing the world economy in the second half of the 19th century, there was generally greater stability in Latin America and an integration of Latin America into the world economy. You're going to see the rapid growth of Latin American exports to industrialized countries. These industrialized countries are in need of raw materials, and that's going to be important to remember when we talk about colonialism in next week's chapter. They also imported manufactured goods, things like textiles, machinery, tools, weapons, and luxury goods. And thus there was a major investment of European and U.S. capital in Latin America because of So here you can see a lot of the raw material exports coming out of Latin America, and you can look at the exports over there to the left. So, did Latin American countries become more like Europe? In some ways. You're going to see growing economies, rapid population increase, rapid urbanization. They also actively sought European immigrants, and remember that map I showed you before, there were some that immigrated from Europe to Latin America, though again, not as much as to North America. Upper class landowners did very well. Again, they're producing the raw material exports that are going to other industrialized nations. The middle class did grow some. However, more than 90% of the population was considered lower. Of that lower class, industrial workers really only made up a modest segment of the lower class. We've talked a lot about the mass migration of people from agricultural areas to the cities. That doesn't mean that nobody was left as farmers. The amount of agricultural output, of course, is going to vary from country to country, and in some cases, agricultural workers remain a huge proportion of society, such as in Latin American countries. There's going to be attempted unions and strikes, which are also harshly repressed. And most of the poor, again, remain rural, as we just said. That might be different depending on the country that you're looking at. Only in Mexico did conditions provoke a nationwide revolution in the Mexican Revolution. And the conflict that goes on with Mexico at this time actually has a direct impact on the United States and our entrance into World War I. So something to keep in mind for. However, the export boom did not cause a thorough industrial revolution within Latin America. There was a little internal market for manufactured goods. Many rich landowners and cattlemen didn't really have an incentive to invest in manufacturing because of that. Governments supported free trade, so cheaper and high quality foreign goods were available, and they were cheaper than could be made at home. And so instead, economic growth was dependent on European and North American investment through raw materials. So, to reflect, historians are fascinated by historical firsts, like the first country to do this, the first example of this. But a focus on first can be misleading. Most first achievements in history were not intentional, and the Industrial Revolution is certainly one of those things. It was not an intentional thing that somebody or a group of people set out to do. It was certainly, as your book describes, an unexpected outcome of converging circumstances. So it's not anything that Great Britain did purposely. It's just, again, a lot of these factors coming together to create the Industrial Revolution, specifically in Great Britain. However, Europeans in general, Great Britain of course being a part of Europe, are going to use the development of industrialization to claim an innate superiority. However, it's important to emphasize the unexpectedness of the Industrial Revolution. It's happenstance. It happened in Great Britain, again, for a variety of reasons that don't have anything to do with any kind of innate superiority of a group of people or a country. The spread of industrialization around the world also diminished the importance of European beginnings. As we said before, it started in Great Britain, but by 1900, other nations had surpassed Great Britain in terms of their industrial output. So they were first, but does that make it any better because they were first? And industrialization will then increasingly be seen as a global process. So again, it's important to understand that it starts in Great Britain and then spreads throughout the rest of the world, but it's important to also understand that that's not because of any kind of superiority to a specific country or a specific ethnic group by any means, though of course at the time that was used as an argument for racial superiority. So for your chapter question for this week, read the following sources: 17.1, 17.2, 17.3a, 17.4, and answer the following question: to what people might the socialist vision be most appealing, and to whom might it seem threatening? Because again, it's not something that's universally appealing. Some nations didn't find much interest in socialism at all. So why did that happen? What's the cause of that divergence there?